Alright, time to jump into Visual Studio. In this demo, I will be creating the model layer. We're going to start building the app right now. I have created a starter solution that already contains a couple of things such as the background image. So now I want to ask you to go to the downloads that come with this course, and in there you'll find an assets folder. In there you'll find a start folder that contains a solution. Double-click this SLN file to open the starter solution. Once Visual Studio is up and running, you'll see that there is very little already in the application. We have the Xamarin Forms core project, that's the Bethany's PyShop stock app that just contains an app.xaml and an app.xaml.cs. In the app.xaml, I have already included the stars that we'll use in the views in this application. Then we have the Android and the iOS application that already contain the images that we'll need. For example, in the Android application, you will see in the resources folder drawable that there is already a PNG that we'll use later on. So first things first, I'm going to start by adding the model. And of course, we'll do that in the shared project. So I'm going to right click here and say, add me a new folder. I prefer to put all my model related stuff inside of a folder called models. In there, we'll start with the creation of our entities. Since this is a simple application, I'll just have one entity that will be the Pi class. The domain model is of course part of what is considered to be the model part in MVVM. So let's add a new class here and let's call that the Pi class. Let's make this a public class and I'm going to add a couple of properties. As you can see here, with their backing fields, I have added an ID, which will be a GUID, a Pi name, a description, a price, an image URL, and the in-stock Boolean property. Now you may be asking, why did he not just include automatic properties? Good question, and I'll come back to that later. Now what is also considered to be part of the model is the repository. In other words, the code that will work with the data. It could be that we need to download a list of pies from a web service, a REST service. It could be that we need to fetch pies from a local database. That is code that, in other words, interacts with an external data source. And I typically put that code inside of a repository class. So let us add here a Pi repository. Let's create a class. Let's also make it public. And let me add a little bit of code here as well. Now, before I show you the code and before I also forget, if you don't want to type all this, which I can definitely understand, please head over again to the assets folder. And in there, you'll also find a models folder that contains the code for this Pi repository. All right, what does it contain? Well, as you can see, for starters, I've made this a static class so that I don't need to instantiate my repository later on. I've also created a static constructor, meaning that just one instance of this Pi repository will be created. I'm checking over here if the list of pies that you see here is actually null. And if it's null, well, then I will initialize the pies to be a new list of pies with some hard-coded pies. And each of these pies contains a GUID, the Boolean value, an image URL, the Pi name, the price, and the description. I've also added this addPi method, which accepts a new Pi. I set the GUID and also use a hard-coded image URL. I then add that Pi to that list of pies. I also have an updatePi method that will update an existing Pi. I will first look for the Pi in the list and then I will update it. And let's bring in systemlink to make sure that this code will compile. So this repository is really the code that interacts with the data. So this repository is really the code that does the dirty details of making sure that the data source is up to date. I'm not using an actual REST service or a database, but that code would typically go in here as well. So at this point, we have already created the model. Let's return to the slides for just a minute.